Colombian visual and material culture, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the BTC and to introduce tonight's program, a screening of the film Two Rivers by Peter Hutton, the Charles Franklin Kellogg and Grace E. Ramsey Kellogg Professor of the Arts and Director of the Film and Electronic Arts Program at Bard College, our parent institution. That will be followed by a conversation about the film, and I would say its ongoing, resonating impact. The conversation will be with Peter Hutton and Josh Siegel of the Department of Film at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, where he has curated numerous exhibitions, including the one on Peter Hutton in 2008. So I guess the question is, how does one do justice in an introduction to the likes of Peter Hutton, whose acclaimed filmmaking career now spans close to 5 decades, during which he has created many films, including At Sea of 2007, he was just talking about it, that was identified by Film Comment magazine with the outstanding accolade, quote, best avant-garde film of the first decade of the 21st century. Perhaps one way to do so, to introduce him, and the way I have chosen to pursue tonight, is to cite the thoughtful words of accomplished filmmakers, or film commentators, I should say, on Hutton's remarkable practice. In conjunction with a display of 2 of his films, At Sea and Two Rivers, at the Peabody Essex Museum in 2012, James Holland, for example, noted, quote, as an avant-garde filmmaker, Peter Hutton has worked to transcend the limitations of words and sounds, allowing images to speak eloquently for themselves. Hutton's work recalls the sense of scale and awe of natural grandeur that characterized the Hudson River School painters, especially Thomas Cole, the painter who worked close to the college. Yet Hutton's work rejects Cole's myopoetic vision, portraying sublime and pristine beauty. Instead, Hutton is haunted by ambivalence toward the mixed blessings for humanity and nature alike of human invention, unquote. Earlier in 2008, when he curated the Hutton exhibition at MoMA, tonight's interlocutor, Josh Siegel, wrote of Hutton, and I quote again, one of cinema's most ardent and poetic portraitists of city and landscape, a former merchant seaman, Hutton has spent nearly 40 years voyaging around the world, often by cargo ship, whether seeking remembrance of a city's fading past or reflecting on nature's fugitive atmospheric effects. Hutton sculpts with time. Beautiful. Hutton sculpts with time. Each film unfolds in silent reverie, with a series of extended single shots taken from a fixed position, harking back to cinema's origins and to traditions of painting and still-life photography, unquote. Initially, by reading these lyrical and inspiring commentaries, I was struck by how certain qualities they elucidated about Hutton's film related to the artist's work in our exhibition and to the conceptual thinking of the exhibition curators, Jose Roja and Alejandro Martin. And I am referring to more than the obvious shared theme of the river. For example, this notion of allowing images to speak eloquently for themselves that Holland argued underscored Hutton's films was a primary goal of our curators. And like him, the different practices of the artists in our exhibition, among them the incredible filmmaker herself, Clemencia Cheverai, Nicolas Consuegra, Alberto Baraya, and Susana Mejia, all confront tensions of various kinds, frequently disturbing and highly problematic tensions between humankind and nature, between natural beauty and terrible environmental degradation, life and death, purity and pollution, violence and peace. Moreover, Hutton's film Two Rivers that we will see together tonight makes other demands on the viewer, or engages in other direct forms of confrontation, most importantly, looking at or turning toward nature that is both ravaged and awe-inspiring, rather than turning away from humanity's role in creating this problematic tension. Here there is another conceptual corollary with our curatorial thinking that Jose Roca brought to Water Weavers when he wanted the visitor very much to grasp or to witness the prevailing phenomena in contemporary life of turning your back on the river. Think about how relevant such a notion is in Manhattan, where until recently, when viewing or coexisting with the river has become desirable, even fashionable, one might easily have forgotten that we are on an island, rivers surrounding us somehow disappearing from the inward or upward gaze that seems to characterize urban life. Two Rivers establishes connections with rivers as far away as China and as close to us as the west side of Manhattan. Rivers that both form a distance and are within proximity, intertwined with thoughts and ideas that also connect our experiences with Colombia, the subject of our exhibition, where there are a multitude of rivers that flow. This poignant film, Peter's film, continues to animate the contemporary and the complexity of political and environmental tensions that the rivers evoke and that demand our attention, perhaps even more so now than when Peter made the film more than 10 years ago. Two Rivers will run for approximately 45 minutes, and we will hear a brief introduction to it by the filmmaker, who I invite to come now. I thank you for coming, and I hope you will enjoy what I know will be an illuminating evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. It's always a little humbling hearing something like that, so I tell people I make silent films for a reason. I never like talking about the work. So anyway, I did want to say a few words, but primarily to sort of contextualize the history of this film. It was commissioned by an absolutely amazing woman named Diane Shamish, who was a very kind of extraordinary public art advocate who worked in New York for many years, and thought it would be interesting to commission a group of artists in the Hudson River Valley, where I live, to do public works. And she came to me, and I had made a number of films about the Hudson River. So she was interested in sort of seeing what I could come up with in terms of a commission going back 10 years ago. And I had been reading a lot about Henry Hudson's voyage up the Hudson River and the diaries that remain, not necessarily his diaries, which were lost in 1509, but the diaries of his pilot, and was intrigued with the idea that Hudson was looking for the trade route to go to the Orient. And at that time, the wisdom was that there was a way to voyage up through the northern climates of North America and eventually come to Asia. So he was looking for Asia at the time. So I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to go to Asia. And I thought, why not go to China? I've always wanted to do something on the Yangtze River. So I've kind of put together this proposal about the two rivers. And she was very intrigued by it. And she said, well, let's do it. So off I went to China and spent about 3 weeks voyaging down the Yangtze and just really documenting the landscape. So it's an incredibly simple film. There's nothing very fascinating about it. It's really, I thought of the tradition of Chinese landscape painting, how it created a sort of scroll-like record of the landscape. And here was a very beautiful historic landscape in China that was really on the verge of being transformed by the Three Gorges Dam, which at the time was the biggest dam in the world. I think it still is. And the water level of the Yangtze was to change significantly by almost 200 feet. So I thought it was important to go there and make a record, a very simple scroll-like record of that landscape, and then compare it with a contemporary record of the Hudson. So it's really two very simple strategies. me moving on ships across the landscape and just recording impressions, so there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. But one of the intriguing things that Diane was interested in is actually showing the work on the Hudson River, not next to the river, but on the river itself. So we commissioned an old friend of mine named John Rubin, who had invented something called the floating cinema, which is essentially a series of barges that he choreographed in the middle of the Hudson River with projectors and screens. And we actually presented this film off Poughkeepsie, New York, and then off Hudson, New York, during several evenings. So the film was initially premiered in the middle of the Hudson River, being projected on these two barges as they slowly traversed the Hudson, going in different directions. So it was an amazing presentation. So to see it as a single channel installation or a presentation is a little uneventful compared to where it's been. And then more recently, the Peabody Essex presented the work in conjunction with an exhibition they did on American landscape painting, particularly Thomas Cole, Church, etc., that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And we did that also as a double projection where the two rivers were projected side by side. So tonight it's a single projection. So imagine yourself going on a 45-minute boat ride, first down the Yangtze and then the Hudson River. And hopefully you won't fall asleep, but if you do, that's okay. I make silent films just to try to encourage people to look more carefully at the images, but sometimes sleep intervenes, and that's not a bad thing in this day and age. We're so besieged by information and sound and whatnot that I think it's good to have a little time out occasionally. And so it happens frequently in my movies. So. But thank you so much for coming, and Nina, Rebecca, everyone, thank you for being so generous and hospitable. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'll see you afterwards. And also my great friend Josh Siegel. Thank you, Josh, for agreeing to chat with me afterwards. So I'll see you later. I'm actually going to project the films. I should say, in this age of digital technology, it's always fascinating to still be a filmmaker working on the medium of film, because almost everything we see in today's world is digital. It comes from this very quiet machine that someone pushes a button to activate. So I actually have to turn this thing on. There's going to be gears turning, and there's going to be a little clatter in the back of the room. Don't be alarmed, it's just a 16-millimeter projector. Thank you.
So I had about 250 questions before watching the film. Now I have about 300. And in the time allotted to us, I think I'll get through maybe 3. But perhaps for those encountering Peter's work for the first time, maybe it would be helpful to talk a little bit about your background and your lifelong fascination with the sea and with maritime culture and industry. And I'm wondering in particular, because you have spoken, of course, about it, whether that happened at a very early age, whether you have very distinct memories as a child of encountering water.
I mean, very much so. My father, when he was a young man, had been a merchant seaman just for a brief period of his life. And he was part of a kind of a bohemian tradition that thought that one went to sea to sort of learn about the world at a young age. And I sort of subscribed to that. But one of the great legacies that he left behind, he died quite young, was that he kept a beautiful photo album that as a child I spent hours looking at. And it was really a record of many of the journeys that he'd been on as a young man, black and white photographs. And if you can imagine, this is sort of in advance of television. So as a child, I was always looking at this photo album, looking at these exotic landscapes from all over the world. And so at a very young age, I was inspired to want to go to sea myself and spend some time on ships, but more so to travel the world and to kind of look at the world in perhaps a more photographic way. And it's interesting, just a small detail, I don't want to go on too long, but the idea, and this, for maybe 20, 30 years in my films, I put a piece of black leader in between the shots to separate each shot. And for many years, I wasn't quite sure why I did that. I did it to sort of disassociate it from traditional editing, where there was a kind of a more montage idea, and there was a cumulative effect of images building on one another, whereas I always thought that each image was potentially its own little episode or film. But at some point I realized that maybe what the black leader was between the films, between the images, was turning the page of the photo album. So it was looking at something, turning the page, looking at something again. And so it sort of I realized that maybe that was this lasting influence of this photographic album. But prior to this, I'd been a painter and spent many years as a young man painting. So I was very interested in a kind of static, contemplative idea of looking at things. And when I got involved in film in the 60s, I sort of wanted to hang on to a different idea of what cinema was. I didn't think of myself so much as a filmmaker, someone using images in a traditional cinematic way, but to use film as a way to keep a record of things that I like looking at. It's interesting, this is a very, 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 very slow film. And of all my films, this is probably the slowest. So you're starting at a very kind of severe point of entry into my work. But if I look at the early work, it looks more like MTV or something, where the shots are shorter, there's jumping around, there's a variety of different subjects. But this is a very austere rendering of these two landscapes, and you may well understand why ultimately I envisioned it as a two-screen projection, which cuts the time in half, and then you can compare the two landscapes. Even though in my perverse kind of avant-garde way, I like the long, slow thing too. It's like watching paint dry or something, which I quite enjoy doing, but I realize that most people, cinema is a much more kind of kinetic, entertaining sort of medium. So I'm sort of taking that away from.
I want to say, though, that I'm glad you brought up pacing and editing, because one thing I'm wondering is that you've filmed waterways, seas, lakes, rivers all over the world, and are you mindful of the fact that every river, for example, has its own rhythms, internal rhythms, its own pace when you edit your films? Does it the Hudson River, for example, is actually a tidal estuary, and it flows in both directions, and it's a place where the river, the seawater meets river runoff from the land. So it actually has these kinds of quirky geological aspects, but the fact that it flows in both directions, I think, is rather interesting about the Hudson.
Yeah.
Do you think about pace of the particular places you're filming when you edit?
No.
You don't? No, it's well, because I actually
hate to conflate your theory.
No. The Yangtze pace is different, it seems to me. The editing is different than it is when you're on the Hudson.
Yeah, I mean, this is a much more drawn-out study, and I was very influenced by sort of traditional, sort of 17th century Chinese landscape painting, and spent a considerable amount of time in the museums in Shanghai looking at these paintings. And what's quite so stunning about it, and I'm sure many of you have visited these museums, but you go into a room and it's dark, and as you approach these beautiful scrolls that are on silk in some cases, the light slowly illuminates. They keep the lights off because it's, threatening to the delicacy of a lot of these paintings. And so you actually go into the room and it's dark, and as you approach, sensors trigger the light and then it rises up. So it's like breathtaking to behold these. And the quality of the black and white that's printed on color gives it a sort of sepia thing, and that was in direct reference to the kind of quality of this of the sort of 17th century landscape painting. So it's a bit of an attempt to kind of reference this other tradition in painting, and it's certainly a very contemplative kind of idea. But in terms of the waterways, there is inherently different characteristics and qualities, and situations are always different depending on what kind of ship you're on, whatnot. And so the films do differentiate depending on where I am and where I'm going. So, but this one was particularly slow. So
you have spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and I obviously don't want us to get into an essentialist conversation, but how would you characterize and how in your experience and thinking have you found non-Western ways of looking different from Western ways of looking? I mean,
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think about this a lot. A lot of my early art teachers were either Chinese or Japanese, and one of my first art classes was a course by an amazing woman in Hawaii, at the University of Hawaii, named Sing-Yu Ho, and she was quite a renowned brush painter, Chinese brush painter. And one of my first painting classes, of course, I painted in the 50s when I was quite young, but with palette knives, and I was kind of emulating the abstract expressionist, and I never really thought much of that work. But when I really seriously got engaged in brush painting, it became clear to me that we would mix our own inks and apply something to a paper and watch how the ink is absorbed into the paper. So it became a much more contemplative, meditative kind of process. And the Eastern influences that I was experiencing in Hawaii in the 60s through my teachers sort of imbued a very, very distinct Eastern attitude that you looked at things, and the longer you looked at things, the more they revealed themselves to you. So it was in giving your attention to the object, whether it was a sculptural garden or a painting, and then in time it would give something back to you. And I'm sure this is our experience in much of painting, but segueing that sensibility into film, which is very much a kind of a feed that it's giving you information. And it's rare in a film context to get in a situation where you're able to approach it in a more contemplative way, because usually I think of Western art as sort of shouting at the viewer, whereas Eastern art is maybe seducing or having a very delicate conversation to engage, but it's not demonstrative in a particular way. Western art is always kind of trying to throttle your attention and say, hey, look at me, I'm crazy, I'm fun, if you think of pop art, for example, which was quite shocking when it emerged, it was the antithesis of, say, something more Eastern. And I think of it now, in particular, the idea of actually looking at things in general has almost become antithetical to newer generations of artists who are so enamored and so involved in technology, which is feeding us so relentlessly information, which is of course exhilarating, and is most cinema, which is like an amusement park ride for the most part. So you kind of strap yourself in and you go on this incredible adventure, but it's unusual to actually do the opposite.
It also seems to me that our experience of time and our sense of loss and obsolescence is very different, that our sense of nostalgia in the West is very different from the idea that things embedded within things and landscapes inherently is the loss and death of them, and that there's an acceptance of it in the East. Again, we're painting with a very broad brush here, and I don't really mean
but one of my strongest influences, going back to photography, is just the idea of using a medium to make a record of something, aside from trying to imbue it with some aesthetic qualities, because one of the great values to me through photography and through painting is the fact that it is a record of a distinct time and a distinct place. And that record, at the time in which you're making it, may not reverberate with much meaning, but over time it accumulates a sense of importance, hopefully, because things change. And I need only to reference the photographs of Auger, the turn of the century in Paris, the fact that he documented the architecture so carefully and so thoroughly that this vast record of what Paris looked like at that particular time, prior to a great urban reorganization of that city, is like invaluable. Whereas he didn't do it for the aesthetic reason. He did it because that was his business of making records of things for businesses and for people that wanted a photograph of their store. But when the surrealists saw his work, they were stunned by the mystery and the sort of the inference of magic that transpired in his photographs through the very long time exposures that blurred movement and created sort of an illusion of mystery because of the great time that it took to make an exposure at that time. So I learned a lot from appreciating just making a record of things and using cinema as a very interesting medium to record impressions of my wandering around the globe, just looking at different places, knowing in fact that they will change. And behind this film was this urgency that this landscape, for the most part, won't exist, and it doesn't exist like this. It's been submerged under a great amount of water, and so a lot of the factories and architecture and things that you are seeing were either demolished prior to the raising of the river. The river didn't rise when I was there, it was prior to that time. But eventually, I mean, imagine going down the Hudson and West Point would be under the water. I mean, something as profoundly affecting the landscape is occurring in China. So I thought, why not make a record of it and just let time sort of render it? It's a kind of a, it's not the most engaging record, but, and then the atmosphere, I don't know if you could tell, but there are points when you can barely see what the hell's going on, and it was because of the phenomenal pollution that we're experiencing. I got a terrible respiratory illness on the ships because I was out on the deck, and the atmosphere as we were going down through these different industrial regions of the Yangtze, the air was so thick and so choked with coal dust and whatnot that eventually I got very sick, and the person I was with said, "Oh, I'll get you some medicine." And we acquired some Chinese medicine, which was, it tasted just like the kind of cherry cough syrup that we had when we were children. I said, "Oh my God, this is great." And I drank the bottle, and it cleared up my respiratory problems within days, And I said, "What was in that medicine?" And this person was also a doctor, and she said, "Well, there's a lot of snake bile in that medicine." And they're like, "Oh, There was something about using the constricting bile of a snake to open up my airways in my lungs, so it was fascinating. But anyway, side story.
Are there, since you've filmed for so many decades on various waterways, are there things that are very difficult to capture when you're filming on water?
It's both the blessing that fortunately ships are very slow in most cases, particularly on the Hudson. When you're moving up and down the Hudson against the tide, you're really going at a very slow speed, and that's wonderful because it enables you to see things much more carefully. It seems like there are many images in this film where you can't even tell that we're actually moving. It depends on the angle of if you're pointing the camera to a beam to the side of the ship, to the shore, it goes by quite quickly, but if you're pointing it towards the bow of the ship, the movement is less perceptive. So it's interesting that on ships you can literally slow down. There's a phenomenon in many of the early sailing ships where you could actually go backwards in time. You would sail into a storm, and the velocity of the storm would actually push you backwards. So even though you were actually moving forward, you were actually being pushed backwards as well. So sailing the ships in general is a very interesting way to travel, which I think most people don't really know about. It's very uncommon for most people to go on ships, but I particularly like the going back in time. I often am introduced as an avant-garde filmmaker, and I say, "Oh no, I'm part of the rear guard." I'm going back in time, which I very much enjoy doing.
I wanted to offer a couple, I apologize, slightly lengthy quotes because I actually...
Oh, God.
No, it's not of you, don't worry.
Okay.
I'm not going to flatter you. But I think it's actually, I unearthed these in preparing this because I actually thought they were kind of a nice way of bracketing two important aspects of your work. One, of course, is from John Ruskin from 1843 in Modern Painters, and the other is Mao Zedong, not himself, but he commissioned a poem called Swimming from 1956, and I'll explain the context of this, I'm sure you know. The Ruskin quote is, "Of all organic substances acting in their own proper nature, and without assistance or combinations, water is the most wonderful. If we think of it as the source of all the changefulness and beauty which we have seen in clouds, Then as the instrument by which the earth we have contemplated was molded into symmetry and its crags chiseled into grace, then as in the form of snow it robes the mountains it has made with that transcendent light which we could not have conceived had we not seen, then it is as it exists in the foam of the torrent, in the iris which spans it, in the morning mist which rises from it, in the deep crystalline pools which mirror its hanging shore, in the broad lake and glancing river, finally in that which is to all human minds the best emblem of unwearied, unconquerable power, the wild, various, fantastic, tameless unity of the sea. What shall we compare to this mighty, this universal element for glory and for beauty? Or how shall we follow its eternal changefulness of feeling? It is like trying to paint a soul. That's from 1843.
Wow.
It's a kind of an extraordinary, I mean, first of all, who writes like that anymore? But it's just, but let me get to the Chairman Mao poem. So he sponsored this poem, Swimming, in 1956 to spur the construction of two hydroelectric dams in the wake of these terrible, terrible floods that devastated the Yangtze River and the lands, the banks of the river. And it wasn't actually until about 40 years later that the Three Gorges Dam was even undertaken. But it was something that actually they had aspired to undertake in the 19-teens. But this is the commission poem. I have just drunk the waters of Changsha and come to eat the fish of Wuchang. Now I am swimming across the great Yangtze, looking afar to the open sky of Chu. Let the wind blow and waves beat, better far than idly strolling in a courtyard. Today I am at ease. It was by a stream that the master said, thus do things flow away. Sails move with the wind, tortoise and snake are still. Great plans are afoot, a bridge will fly to span the north and south, turning a deep chasm into a thoroughfare. Walls of stone will stand upstream to the west to hold back Wushan's clouds and rain, till a smooth lake rises in the narrow gorges. The mountain goddess, if she is still there, will marvel at a world so changed. So what I find extraordinary about these two quotes is that, for me, they touch upon two of the most important aspects of your work for me, which is the poetic and the exploitative, the poetic and the industrial, the uses of these waterways, and the waterways as a place for reflection, of contemplation, of abstract thought. And it seems to me interesting because the film, for me, embodies those two concepts. And I suppose that was a comment more than a question, but one of the things I wonder in your use of silence is the opportunity for abstraction. Of course, when we watch these films, we are given to ruminating and also just kind of letting our mind wander.
Falling asleep.
No, not falling asleep. Letting our mind wander. There's a huge difference. But I think actually the silence is a way of underscoring that aspect of water, that it inherently invites us to contemplate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a tough question to actually answer, but
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. I mean, being at sea is it's like the last frontier. It's sort of like being in outer space, even though I haven't quite been in outer space. I mean, I wanted to be, but it is a very interesting domain. I mean, of course, there's sound all the time on ships. They make a tremendous amount of sound, but it's the idea that you're sort of detached from civilization, kind of floating on this very kind of heavenly body. And it certainly encourages a different kind of remuneration, I think, about being on the planet. And, those are beautiful kind of allusion or references to that, I think, in some way. The idea that most rivers, and I think this is what's so engaging about the exhibit here, is that there's a kind of functionality to rivers which are utilitarian, they're industrial, there's a practical, they're highways, they're the original highways of culture as well as of an industry. And so they have this duality. And one of the things I wanted to show is the fact that there is a relationship between this sort of industrial world and this more ethereal kind of romantic idea of a landscape. And it's very inherent in most rivers, for the most part, particularly the Hudson and particularly the Yangtze. I mean, the Yangtze has been almost destroyed as a river of inspiration The early part of the film is actually in a tributary off the Yangtze called the Little Gorges, which was a side trip, but it was so pristine and so beautiful, and it revealed perhaps the landscape that once was more common along the banks of the Yangtze, but there were parts of the Yangtze that have been so heavily industrialized because of the practicality of shipping and whatnot. And the idea of the dam was to raise the level of the river so bigger ships, freighters, international ships could travel to Chongqing, which is now a major port in China, which historically ships couldn't navigate. The Yangtze is such a treacherous river that it was limited to a certain amount of a certain type of ship with a very shallow bottom. But they've since changed that, so it's now like a deep water thoroughfare. So it's all about economics.
Mhm.
It's all about electricity.
And survival on some level.
Huh?
And survival. on some
Survival.
level.
To see the dam is so astounding as something that man has made. At the time, the biggest dam in the world. I think China has since built a second dam further up the Yangtze in an area called Leaping Tiger Gorge. But as we were approaching Wuhan, I think it was, the city closest to the dam, I was looking at the landscape, and there was this very sinuous kind of wave to the landscape, and I noticed at one point that there was a big flat, there was the top of a mountain that was actually flat, and I went, whoa, that's unusual. And then I realized that they'd actually chopped off the top of a mountain and moved it down and used it for the landfill to make the dam. And so there was an alteration of the landscape that was almost incomprehensible in terms of the magnitude of altering, this magnificent
That had
landscape.
been, I'm sure, portrayed for hundreds or not thousands of years
Exactly.
in poetry and in painting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not totally dissimilar, of course, to what happens in West Virginia with the clear cutting. And
Exactly.
everything.
It's the same idea.
But-
And they're relentlessly doing it all across China. So the environmental implications of what's going on in China are staggering, to say the least. And whether they can recover, whether the environment can recover from this onslaught of industrialization is another question. But the Yangtze has been, for the most part, destroyed ecologically. So that's not good. I mean, the Hudson, think of the Hudson. Like 10 years ago, GE, which had been historically allowed legally to dump PCBs into the Hudson up in Fort Williams, fought very much against the removal of these toxins in the river. And they launched a $20 million ad campaign that played throughout the Hudson River Valley for many years, convincing people that the Hudson was fine, the fish are good, and everything. But they, through their own relentless, which is, it's a corporate kind of strategy, were able to release these poisons into the river. And any developing country is going to do that. You sort of sacrifice your environment for the benefit of development, and then hopefully you can recover from that. So the Hudson is slowly recovering, but
now we have to contend with LG marring the vistas.
Yeah.
Of the building of the factory on the Palisades.
yeah.
never
I mean, there's always something going on, but that's another issue. And,
Let me ask one
yeah.
last question before we invite
Sure.
you to ask some questions.
People
which
are
is-
probably dying to
so,
leave. Yeah.
So you were talking about the diptych, showing
Yeah.
this as a diptych, and you've moved in recent years into exploring gallery installations, and I wonder it's not only a temporal experience, of course, the idea of showing these side by side and cutting in half the length of the film, but also, of course, a spatial one. And I wonder what kinds of experiences or thoughts you've had about projecting film or projecting moving images in a gallery space as opposed to a theater.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's more of the idea of sort of trying to be a little bit more flexible. I always thought of myself as a kind of a cinematic purist in a way, and doing it very much in the sort of tradition of cinema. But recently there have been opportunities through museums and galleries to present the work in the context of a gallery. And that invites a slightly different relationship to the work. As you know, anybody that walks into a contemporary gallery and sees an installation, there's generally not a seating configuration like this, and so people aren't quite as inclined to sit down and to really study the work as carefully. It's generally kind of a walkthrough situation, and I understand that, but when you really want people to sit, I mean, the great thing about a theater is you have people hostage for a while, and they don't have a great choice in terms, they can get up and leave, of course, but in a walkthrough situation, you want to try to kind of provide something. Like, one of the concepts I discussed with Diane Shamish, this wonderful woman that commissioned this film, was to create a gallery space with, initially I thought of deck chairs, like on passenger ships, where you could kind of stretch out and really space out a bit and watch it, because that's sort of the idea of being on a ship. You want to relax, And then I thought about these swiveling chairs that you could kind of spin around at, and so we would have multiple projections, and you could like spin in your chair and look at that, and spin over here and look at that. So all these variables come into play in terms of your imagination. And they're really about trying to seduce the viewer to look, but yet to be comfortable. You don't want to put a lot of just hard benches down, because people would be less inclined to relax. And part of the idea of much of the viewing thing is an act of sort of seducing people a little bit, We've never made it as far as the deck chairs, and I still think there's some possibilities in this,
There was a wonderful Bruce Nauman installation, do you remember?
Idea, which I love. Yeah.
Of his, what happens in his studio at night, shot with night photography of various mice running around the studio. But you had rolling desk chairs, and so people would roll all over this vast gallery space, and kids, of course, loved it. But
yeah,
it made it kind of a joyous experience.
No, exactly. And Carolina and I spent hours in the Dia space, rolling around in these chairs. And what you observe in most installations is most people just kind of come in and give it a peek, and then boom, they're out of there. Very few people really engage. I mean, to sit in a space like Dia and watch mice and insects moving through Bruce Nauman's studio is it's akin to sort of watching paint dry too. It's like you have to be committed to that experience. If it was my studio, I don't think people would stay around too long. But the fact that it's Bruce Nauman's studio made it a little bit more enticing to the audience. But
you don't have a mouse problem.
No, not yet.
We attempted this in the exhibition by
Oh, really?
chairs.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Well, that's lovely.
In the space, in the third floor installation in the Cheverai room.
I love that big oak chair.
Yes, bamboo.
Bamboo.
Yeah, but for that very reason.
Yeah, it makes it a very different, more enveloping experience. So does anyone want to ask? Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you.
First time I've ever seen a film like this. Well, I have a couple of questions. Number one is that, the Hudson River has cleaned up a bit. And there's not as much traffic as there used to be in the 1800s because of the railroad. So I wonder, what happened with the Chinese? Because you mentioned that the Yangtze River has now been destroyed. Had they created a railroad system so they wouldn't have to depend on, roading the river, or, that's my question. And also, I noticed that in one of the last films, one of the last shots is that there was all this pollution going into the river. So have the Chinese created any, any prevention, not allowing pollutants into the river?
Well, I know that there are efforts underway. I met a very interesting Chinese architect, contemporary architect, whose real mission, and he was in residence at Harvard University, and I met him at a conference at the University of Pennsylvania that was based on water. And so a lot of designers, architects came from all over the world to participate, and they invited me to show one of my river films, just as kind of a respite from what was this relentless, it's like speed dating, people giving papers on their projects based on water. And his project was really to, as an architect, to clean water. And it involves plants, and it involves finding different species of plants that can actually clean the water. And so he designs a lot of projects in China just to clean up the environment that obviously uses very interesting architectural elements and design elements, and also to reclaim a lot of the waterways that have been abandoned to pollution and industrial usage. And it's something that happens everywhere, where a waterway, a river, is like essentially a very convenient natural sewer for industry. And so it's moving in and out, and it's taking all that stuff away from where it originates. But like in America, when I was young, I worked on the Great Lakes on the ships, and we used to go to Cleveland. Cleveland was one of the most polluted water systems in the Great Lakes, and they've since reclaimed this landscape for primarily residential, and as they have Gowanus Canal, you see this happening all the time. If you look at the west side of Manhattan, it wasn't necessarily industrial, but it had a utilitarian purpose with shipping and whatnot. And now there's bike paths and there's parks and promenades. So hopefully a lot of, if China's able to recover, they're working to restore a lot of these environments that have been sacrificed to development, let us say. And I'm not an expert on this, but it was very intriguing watching this particular fellow who his whole business was about reclaiming these savaged industrial sites through a very innovative understanding of ecology and bringing in plant species that could actually gobble up. There's a whole movement in ecology to bring in plants that can feed on toxic materials, for example, as well as human sewage.
Oysters, of course.
Yeah.
Someone else?
I think I feel lulled into your view, which is in this. I'm Susan Stroud, by the way.
Hi, Susan. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. That there's this calm, and I felt very annoyed at seeing the buildings, and I'm glad they're underwater. And I love the kind of drama of your, what's the fire that comes out of the sky? What's that? Lightning.
Lightning, yeah. That was fortuitous.
It was, but it's like this slow thing, and then there's some ugly architecture on the sides of the river, which I didn't like. And then a punctuation mark, and then I was wondering how you were going to end this thing with all your little Chinese people in their umbrellas. That was very sweet.
Well, the idea of that last shot was they're getting out of the way of the rising water with their they're going up the steps, and so it's a more metaphoric idea, even though most people don't get that. But it's sort of like, how do we end this thing? We go to higher ground. That's what we do.
There are thousands of people who are relocated. I don't know how many.
Yeah, there are scenes in the Yangtze where you see in the foreground the old city that's been abandoned and destroyed. And by the way, there's like many fascinating. Chinese cinema is absolutely has spent a great effort in chronicling this transformation, particularly along the Yangtze. And there's a number of really significant feature films that deal with this huge change. Over 1.5 million people were relocated along the Yangtze that had been there for centuries and generations. And so you can see in some of the shots there are these modern apartment buildings way up on the hills, and that's what the government did. They recreated the cities on much higher ground, knowing that the cities that were closer to the water's edge would be abandoned. So
I also like that you left in some of those gorgeous mountain, like the foreground, the middle ground, the back. Those are those Chinese paintings, aren't they? Those beautiful landscapes.
Yeah.
Boy, I didn't think that still existed. Maybe it doesn't anymore.
Well, it's also that China is so vast. The magnitude of that landscape is just astounding. You think America's vast and Grand Canyon and whatnot, but when you see, and I just had a glimpse of a particular region, there's something so big about it that you can see that changing the water level in the Yangtze, most people wouldn't even notice it, because the landscape itself is so magnificent in scale. So I tried to show that early on, where it's almost like a geological survey, because you're just looking at the different stratas and the different configurations of the physical landscape itself. So,
Nice.
But thank you, Susan.
thank you both.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for having
Okay.
us.